Hello everybody, my name is Jordan Parks and I am doing a review for Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Discipleship Volume 4. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German-born pastor and theologian born in Prussia on February 4, 1906. He is most famous for being outspokenly opposed to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party's stance on eugenics and elimination of the Jews. His book, The Cost of Discipleship, or in the German, just Discipleship, is his staunch beliefs on how the Christian life should be lived. His main text is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Discipleship was written around the topic of grace. The term cheap grace is a term he uses extensively and learned from during his trip to the United States. He sat under Adam Clayton Powell Sr. while studying at Union Theological Seminary in New York, and would learn from the African American church in America and how they handled social struggles, and he brought their tactics back to Germany to use against the Nazis. Discipleship was published in 1937 as the Nazi Party was gaining significant ground in Germany, both politically and militarily. Bonhoeffer's famous work would be an exhortation to the German people, who now had evil staring them in the face. Bonhoeffer would call the apathetic German Christians to their feet to stand for Christ in the midst of one of the darkest times in German history. Discipleship begins with Bonhoeffer speaking about grace. He attacks what he calls cheap grace, a grace that saves once and for all, that covers all sin, past and future, while allowing the sinner to remain in sin. His main point in the early parts of the book deal with comparing cheap grace and costly grace, which is a grace that was paid for at a very high price by the Son of God, Jesus Christ. Bonhoeffer suggests that cheap grace is unmerciful, and that it closes our way to know Christ rather than open it. Listen to what Bonhoeffer says about the effects of cheap grace. It could not happen any other way, but that possessing cheap grace would mislead weaklings to suddenly feel strong, yet in reality they had lost their power for obedience and discipleship. The word cheap grace has ruined more Christians than any commandment about works. The second thing Bonhoeffer moves on to is obedience. It is the sign of whether or not a person holds to cheap or costly grace. Obedience, he explains, is an instantaneous action that takes place when one believes in Christ. He goes to the example of the call of the disciples. When Jesus first called Peter from his boat, Peter left immediately. He poses the notion that it is ridiculous for a man, Peter, to just listen to this guy Jesus and not sit around for a few days to ponder whether he should go with him or not. Bonhoeffer says that Peter leaves not on account of personal gain, a sense of adventure, or anything else, but solely on the fact that Jesus is God and Peter wants to follow him. The author makes it clear that this is how Christians should come to Christ, just for the sake of Christ. He continues to argue that no religious system or doctrinal code requires discipleship, but following Christ does. It requires the believer to give something up, because you either have all of Christ or you have none of him at all. It is the lingering thought that laces every sentence for the first two chapters. Jesus Christ is worth following, and he must be followed at all costs. Some of the difficulties that I found in the text were trying to figure out when Bonhoeffer was talking about cheap grace as opposed to costly grace. Bonhoeffer uses sarcasm frequently in his first few pages of the book, and unless read carefully and wholly, one can misunderstand his message. Another difficult hurdle in reading Discipleship is that Bonhoeffer does not offer many natural breaks as he writes. Ideas flow out of each other, and it seems as if sometimes he does not tie up what he wanted to say before he goes on to the next point. There is no doubt that of the passion and zeal in which Bonhoeffer wrote this. When you begin reading the first two chapters, it almost seems as if he is sitting across the table from you, looking you in the eyes and pleading with you to follow Christ more closely. The passion in his writing is outstanding, but it may also be part of why his thoughts do not compartmentalize to help the reader understand fully where he's coming from. This is not to say that his book is not readable or confusing, but rather that it must be read with great attention and with a bit of backtracking to get the full message.